Power creep. It's a hell of a thing, or I would say it used to be. I don't think power creep in today's day and age could be defined the same way it was probably a year ago, or even from the launch of the game. I think the way the game has shifted to this point is less about the units themselves and more about the skills, which is why I wanted to make this video. I don't think power creep in and of itself is what we're dealing with anymore. I think for the most part, most units that tend to come out nowadays is pretty much just stuff that we've had in the past with maybe a 1 or 2 new effects, or maybe they're just a bit better at what a previous unit was able to do. I do think there are absolute outliers, of course, such as Freyr, Windclawed, but in general, I think it's less about the units at this point. It doesn't surprise me that a lot of the newer editions tend to rinse and repeat what we had in the past and just do it a bit better, mainly because they're going on 7 years on this game and they're running out of ideas, or I would say they're running out of ideas, but sometimes they surprise me in certain areas. Even still, a lot of the most powerful units in the game tend to just be what a lot of other units were able to do, but with 1 or 2 more gimmicks, or they have something that at least allows them to stand out a bit more. For example, let's look at Alear. By herself, she's a fast infantry sword. Tons of those exist in the wild. What makes her so different from everybody else? Well, if you ally support her with anybody, they get charge. It may not necessarily be the grandest, but it's something that allows her to be distinct from other units that might otherwise just be this unit but better. For example, Ascended Fur versus Ascended Merida, who are just basically the same unit, but the former is just significantly stronger because more stats, and yada yada yada, you get the drift there. I do think what makes this interesting, and I'm going to go into the fodder aspect and arcanes in a bit, but I find with newer additions and stuff that just comes out as of late, stats have become less and less important. And not to say that stats aren't important by any means, because you obviously need stats to function, but I don't think they matter as much now as they did maybe a few years ago, or even just last year, but it does wholly depend on the unit, of course. Newer units just tend to have a way more optimized stat line. Rarely do we have anybody that just has a weird stat line going for them. They have less flower costs. They have no real importance when it comes to merges, because at the end of the day, their weapons tend to make up for the amount of stats that they have anyway. And if you're going for merges, the most you're getting out of it is Spectrum 4, which isn't exactly the biggest loss. It may mean something against Giga Whales, but otherwise it's not really the biggest issue there. If anything, I think the issue more so lies with older units, because trying to invest in any of them just to have them functional is a lot more difficult comparatively. And this is where I want to get into the main topic of it all. I don't think power creep is necessarily an issue anymore. I think the biggest issue is skill creep, which you could definitely argue is like, oh, it's the same thing but a different code of paint. And to that I say, well, maybe you're right, but I wanted to make this video, so yeah, like and subscribe. I would say prior to Book 7, a lot of the focus more so came from units that had really good PRFs, because at the time, while we did have decent enough inheritables, I don't think there was enough pushing the envelope on that end. It was more so the units that came with 7 effects in their weapon. But I would say after the rearmed lift banner, that's probably when we started seeing more of a shift, whether that's due to inheritable B slots, really powerful A slots that we're now getting, new weapons that are inheritable to everybody and have a minimum of 5 effects. It means that they can continually push the envelope that way, but because everyone more or less does the same thing with arcanes, the bar for any unit to work in any sort of mode nowadays is so much lower than it was easily a year ago because of the weapons and skills they now have access to. The difference in performance is definitely going to be less dramatic comparatively, but that comes with a cost in said skills that are getting added to the game. If you've noticed across the entirety of Book 7, you'll notice that we've gotten a significantly high amount of inheritables going for that book. Obviously, newer banners tend to come with newer stuff so people can pull for, but you may have noticed that every single banner has something new to inherit, at least at a tier 4 version. Even if it's just a variant, the idea that they're continually adding more and more skills for people to pull for has probably made more people pull this year than in any other year. Granted, there's no actual statistic to prove that, but I think the difference now is that more units are reliant on newer skills to function, rather than just getting the brand new unit to function in the way they need to. And I don't think that's necessarily bad in some aspects, because you can pretty much build whoever you want and they can function at whatever level you really need them to function at. I think it's great in that regard, but because they keep adding newer skills that arguably are going to be some of the best that you could give to certain units, it makes it much more difficult to keep up, especially if inheritance becomes a bigger issue, which I already talked about it in another video, but the TLDR of that mainly is that we don't have enough inherit slots and they keep pumping out newer skills that units really need to function at a high level. And again, you can get away with a lot of stuff as is in a regular PvE setting, but you're really going to be doing that with a lot of the newer units rather than the older ones, because again, investing into a specific unit nowadays is incredibly difficult, which I never really understood from a marketing perspective, because any unit prior to book 5, in my opinion, is probably going to be worse than anything that is released to this day. So I never really understood why they have to make it so difficult. Granted, there are definitely units from X book that are still relatively good, but I don't think you'll find one specific unit from that area that is remotely close to the level of something from book 7, which maybe I'm wrong on that, but I think as a general thing, again, it's really just going to fall in line with that for the most part. And back to the skill creep for a second, this isn't a gradual thing by any means either. New skills are continually being littered across every single banner that we're getting. Sometimes they may just be skills that were finally added to the normal pool, sometimes there'll be different variants that specific units are absolutely wanting, or specific people may want for popular units. The point being is that they continually drop these new variants or new line of skills, or tier 4 versions, that makes keeping up with the game much more difficult, especially on units that come with multiple lines of skills or weapons that you can't inherit all at once. I think the most recent memory of that definitely came from Aether, who had an Arcane and Beast Sense 4, and while I wouldn't say Beast Sense 4 is the craziest inheritable, if you wanted to get both of those, you would have to pull 2 Aether, which I think is kind of ridiculous. Again, they could easily fix this, but I don't think they really need to. And I think the reason they're not going to be upgrading it is because they can get more people to spend more orbs or money on specific banners just so they could get all the skills that they necessarily need. Because again, before, oh, maybe you just needed the new legendary or the new green tome or whatever the hell you needed. Now you need whatever they come with. And sometimes those units may have a bunch of skills that you may need and you can't get them all at once. So rather than going for one unit, you may need to go for the unit multiple times just so that you can invest in X unit that you want to invest into. And this also brings me to another point. I'm guilty of this too, and I want to preface that. Lately, when you see newer banners with newer units that are like, oh, this is the new Lance Flyer, or ooh, this is the new infantry sword, you may look at it and be like, oh, cool, another infantry sword. Yawn, next. A lot of units just tend to feel samey, and if you've been around enough, you may look at a new unit and shrug it off despite how much they offer because they don't push the envelope. And when I mean push the envelope, I mean they don't break the meta in such a way that you necessarily need to run God Sword number 2000 over God Sword number 1999. And I think that in and of itself is fine. But I think they also know that they're kind of in a rut, and I brought this up earlier in the video where units don't really do much new different nowadays, again, minus the outliers. So rather than trying to sell a unit that, oh, is just a better X unit, they can introduce a new line of skills or more fodder for people to pull for. And I think that's where we're at right now, because truth be told, a unit can only be so bad nowadays. Granted, not every unit has an arcane right now, but we're eventually going to get to that point. And even if X arcane is worse than Y arcane, the bar is still going to be at a suitable level to where you can use whatever Joe Schmo you really want to and succeed in wherever you need to. Like hell, I capped SDR with a Spring and Ego, and I'm not going to claim he's crazy good by any means. He's a generic bow flyer with a good stat line. That's all he offers. But if I can pull off something like that, imagine what you could do with any other unit with the right investment. I'm not saying this is definitive because again, not everybody has something they can use at the moment. But as it currently stands, I think it's less about the units themselves and more about the skills they come with. I think it does somewhat make sense given the longevity of the game so far. They're running out of units, in my opinion, to put on normal banner, so they probably want to pad it out either by alts, which can really just be there for the sake of character, or newer skills that people will pull for just because the effect is good. And if you've noticed that a lot of the additions nowadays, maybe if it's like a brand new tier 4 skill, it's probably a combination of 2 or 3 skills. Like recently we had Halloween Flame announced, and she has Dazzle Far Trace, which is literally just Far Trace with Dazzling Staff. They've been doing this for quite a while at this point, and it doesn't surprise me. I do think it makes the game a bit more interesting combining effects and skills like that for newer inheritables, but you end up noticing that these skills skills end up being significantly stronger than what you had prior, and you may think, oh, might need this for X unit going forward, because the upgrade between tier 3 and tier 4 is so much more significant. And that doesn't apply to every single skill, but more often than not, they just tend to be so much better than what they were prior. I do think we're at a point where we need more inheritable slots per unit. They're not fast enough, in my opinion, to drop X skill in the Y pool, just so people can inherit X amount of skills, which can still be relatively limited at times, especially if there are 2 tier 4 skills that they just can't inherit at one go. You know, Halloween Anna, for example. It might also be why they didn't limit the duplication process on a rearmed. Maybe I'm giving them too much credit and thinking that they probably saw this coming, but I think now with the way the game is, it's less about the power creep and more about the ability to get people to pull for new skills and inheritables, which is what led me to make this video. I think power creep is no longer the issue. I think it's skill creep. It definitely has its benefits and drawbacks. I like the idea that everyone's able to build whatever unit they want, and even if they have the same copy-paste build that everybody else is running, I don't really think that matters because it's a unit you want to build, and at the end of the day, I think that's what's most important. Yet at the same time, having to keep up every single year is a bit of a detriment, and I wish they would make it much easier to do so, but I don't think they're going to do that for a long while. Also, please nerf this guy, thank you.